Hey everyone, it's time for another pancake breakfast. And today our topic is about policy as code and how policy as code extends into infrastructure as code. And this is a topic of interest to us at the New Stack as we see the need for more policy as distributed architectures get more and more complex, both on-premise and in the cloud. And joining us for our discussion today is Deepak Giridarakapal.
Hello.
Hey, how you doing, Deepak?
I'm doing all right.
Deepak is CTO at Puppet, and it's great to have you here. Tiffany Jasha is Data Engineering Manager at Vox Media. Hi, Tiffany.
Hello.
James Turnbull, Vice President of Engineering at Sotheby's.
Hi, folks.
And SHEA Stewart, a DevOps tech nerd, so he goes by. And I was so excited, for this event because I brought my pancakes. But I wanted to ask SHEA, did you bring anything to eat? Do you need any syrup or anything?
I could use some syrup for my pancakes if you'd like to have a look at them first. Maybe we've got some from our sponsor today. Oh, we lost part of Puppet's logo there. But of
delicious.
course,
the resilience will still make it a delicious breakfast.
Yes.
We'll automate the rebuild afterwards.
Exactly.
And then we've also got some from the new stack today, a little more colorful.
That's great. Well, I do happen to have some syrup. Let me pass it your way.
Beautiful. Thanks very much. Now, I guess we need to flip them, don't we? Do we need a flipper?
Yeah, you do.
Mine's a little special. I'll pass it off to James. Maybe mine is my trusty camping flipper. It's a little bit dangerous, so please be careful.
Okay, and I think that we probably need a cup of coffee or something while we're doing this, just to get awake in the morning. So I'm gonna pass it off to Deepak.
All right, I will take that one. Representing breakfast in my neck of the woods is Count Spatula. But breakfast is nothing without coffee, so I'll have some. And in case Tiffany, you want any, I will.
Oh, yeah, sure. Wow, thanks. I think it wouldn't be fully breakfast with Tiffany's without the whole thing.
There you go.
I'll pass over.
Well, excellent. I'm so glad we're here with pancakes and discussions on policy as code, and I want to get right into it. And, in thinking about this discussion, I thought about, the roots of infrastructure as code and policy as code. And I think it was something that was said in our discussion beforehand was how we really do need policy today. Just because of the complexity that we see. But my question to start, and maybe Tiffany, you could help us kind of get our heads around this, are misconfigurations. And we know that in Kubernetes, for instance, configurations are something that a lot of people do. It's not just one person, there's multiple personas. So my question is, how bad is it out there? How common are misconfigurations? And what are you seeing as some of the typical resolutions that show a need for policy as code?
Yeah, sure. I love that background because I think in this past year, even we've seen a lot of mishaps, and they've led to either security vulnerabilities or hacks, and the impacts are very lasting, right? It's not just impacting a particular team; it's impacting full businesses and the customers of their customers, right? And actually, misconfigurations are very, very common. I think 80% of security hacks were reported to be caused by misconfigurations. And so this is actually people who go into, Kubernetes or go into a dashboard and they're, setting up some type of configuration and they accidentally happen to push it. Or maybe they configure infrastructure as code and it's misconfigured. And while we can still get the alerting and the monitoring in place to find out this was misconfiguration and then go back and fix it, there's not as many I think nowadays pipelines that tell us, hey, this is actually broken. This is actually a breaking change that you're pushing. So let's not.
Anyone want to kind of take their look at misconfigurations and how bad they are?
I think we happen to be in an era technologically where I think there's simultaneously there's way more knobs and switches on all the different building blocks that people use to build their applications, build their infrastructure, like the whole thing, everything in the estate. There's more stuff, and I think there's more ways to configure it, and I think it's distributed and sprawled out to a certain extent. And I think it's become more important that those knobs and switches have the same state across all the different instances of different things. There's been outages, related to, I made a change over here and it didn't propagate correctly over there. And, and then like half of S3 is down, and I can't get my dank memes off the internet anymore, which is like the worst. So, I think it's, strangely, some of the parts of the problem are kind of evergreen. Even though the technologies themselves have changed, it's like now instead of maybe I have to flip bits on a file on a disk somewhere, it's like, IAM roles or security controls on a cloud resource. Or so I think the stakes are high and the complexity is also high. So in a weird sense, despite all the technological innovation, we still find ourselves in this spot that I think feels very familiar to me.
So James, how would you define policy as code? We're talking about these misconfigurations and how they are resolved, and and how policy as code might be a way is a natural evolution. But what is it, and what does policy really mean?
I mean, I think there's a few different ways of looking at it. I tend to focus on policy as sort of an overarching set of I guess, guidelines. Like Tiffany sort of hit the nail on the head, right? You can easily push the configuration that isn't right, but doesn't appear to be wrong, and therefore leave yourself vulnerable. Or as Deepak said, and some people have discovered quite recently, you can push something, a change, and have it not propagate. I think policy allows you to set at a high level, like there's a series of statements or rules across the environment that either flag an alert or refuse to let you do something that is in breach of a policy. So instead of having to worry about, Deepak talked about the various layers. Back in the olden days, we talked about like a sort of host level or application level configuration, and now we've got an abstraction layer that might be Docker and Kubernetes, and another abstraction layer might be a cloud provider, another abstraction layer might be some sort of application interface or admin console. We now have to make sure that all of the things in that chain are configured in the right way and they're configured consistently. And a policy is a good way to do that by being able to say, you can't do this thing. Like overall, no one can do this in production, or there's some other characteristic of the world. Policy allows you to constrain that decision across all of those layers of abstraction, across all of that complexity.
SHEA, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think to James's point a little bit, and policy can extend a number of different ways. And so if we look at misconfigurations and we go down there, one of the biggest issues that we have is lack of education. New technology comes out, we don't know how to actually lock it down. And Kubernetes is a huge example of this in many ways, where if somebody, let's just say I was wanting to deploy a certain application into maybe a more hardened system like OpenShift, and I followed a blog. What I didn't understand was that the blog actually was doing something harmful, because it told me that it allowed me to run something that would essentially allow me to run as root. And the admin who has control over this sort of platform and system might not be aware of what that command or that action is doing. And so when we talk about layering policy over top of that, I think of two different things. One, kind of as James was saying, maybe I'm not allowed to actually run that level of privilege command against a Kubernetes infrastructure that would allow me to make such a change. But as we move into sort of infrastructure as code, and I kind of want to throw in, the nice buzzword of something like GitOps into this world, we can actually have policy as workflows around humans, and to control how any of the code that we want to push down to the system is actually reviewed by team members across disciplinary teams or different disciplinary teams, because that's the issue that we have today is, configuring our system does require one person to kind of wear many hats that it would traditionally be outside of their domain of control, right? We kind of, started blending who can do what at what level, like James was talking about, from the OS now to the API abstraction layer or to the cloud layer. So for me, policy also extends to how do we get changes into production, and the human element around that, and being able to actually show through sort of a codified system that's enforced. So I'm using GitOps as an example of being able to do that for change management.
I think I'm going to show pancakes anytime someone says GitOps, or maybe maybe configuration, but I think GitOps is better. So let's Tiffany, any what do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean by how do you interpret this? What Shay's saying in terms of the context about the context of infrastructure as code.
Yeah, I love what Shay's saying. I think it makes a lot of sense because, in a lot of ways, we've had to take ownership of a lot more than we anticipated, especially when it came to the cloud and scaling and security, right? And so now we have so many different aspects of a software development lifecycle that we have to think about whenever we are going to make a change, even if it's just a small one or it's a configuration change, right? And so with policy as code, it kind of follows that same pattern as what we already have with infrastructure as code. With infrastructure as code, we kind of understood like, hey, now we have a way of modeling, or we have a common language of modeling what exactly we want to have in terms of infrastructure, whether it's the number of instances that we have running of an application. You can pretty much define whatever you want as it relates to infrastructure. And now you can do the same thing with policies, right? And policies just represent coded logic. It's no different from what the rules that we have instinctively as teams already. But the difference here is that now we can code this up and model it in language. And what happens is, we have this policy or this piece of code that we define, right? And we have our systems, our environments, our applications, our services, whatever it is that we're trying to target, right? The policy, the systems, and then the actual input now. So as we take actions, as we do different things, as for example, users use an application, we are getting input, and that input can help alongside our systems and our policies can combine together into like what we know as policy as code and the systems that we build around it. So I think it's very nice because you have a very parallel or very similar track in infrastructure as code, and so I see it as an extension, which is quite nice.
One way I think about it, because I talk with a lot of there's a ton of Puppet users that I've talked to over the years, and I think at a high enough altitude, I kind of think about policy as code and infrastructure as code as being very related, but they show up in like two major areas in my mind. At least those are the two that come to mind. I think number one is it changes a little bit. I think like who is sort of allowed to care about what, and who's expected to care about what. And then the second one is like making it more readily available for people to do something about it. So the first one, I think, like a lot of things in infrastructure as code, like there's been this evolution of, in the beginning of the stuff that you were automating was the stuff that was closest in. So like I'm a server admin, I deal with the config on a server. I think as time has gone on, as the abstractions have gotten better, now if you're like in site reliability engineering and it's like a cloud-based thing, chances are you probably care about networking. Software defined networking, but you probably care about it. You probably care about storage, software defined storage, again in the cloud, but you probably care about that. And I think policy as code kind of just brings in bounds, I think, for a lot of people and a lot of teams, like, oh, okay, now I need to start caring about this too. This isn't necessarily somebody else's problem that they're just going to figure out. And I think complementing that is because it's represented as code, to Shay and Tiffany's earlier points, I think it allows you to start treating it the same way that you treat other code in the system. So now if you make a change over here, you can also demand that, maybe as part of peer review, hey, has the corresponding like guardrails, for this stuff also been changed? Or you roll out a new feature, what are the constraints and methods of locking this stuff down? Is that included as part of the same kind of package that people are looking like? So I think it's kind of changed what's in bounds. And it's not that people didn't care about security or governance or anything like that before. I think it's just more like now we have better tools that I think it allows a wider swath of people to actually care about that problem and do something about that problem. And I think that's really interesting. I think that's powerful, but maybe also a bit terrifying depending on what side of the line you're on, I guess. But I'm all for any movement or practice that surfaces more of these issues that have always been there, but just getting it in front of more people with better ways to actually deal with it.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what sticks out in my mind is always the human element of all of this, which is getting it in the hands of more people and allowing them to understand or sort of collaborate around one topic, and inviting the right people to the table maybe as well. I think traditionally, when we look at even sort of the DevOps and platform teams, still for a very long time have kind of ignored or left out the security aspect of it. And while we try to say that everybody's responsible for security, I've worked in enough large enterprise organizations where there was a very big wall between sort of the two sort of sets of orgs. So one team was advancing and sharing and doing more than what they typically would have done before, but then security became the wall where it had to go over to them and then had to be delayed because everything had to be interpreted in their own world. Now with this idea of policy as code, we can actually invite everybody to the table, have a conversation, and kind of create this new role of sort of the security code generator that maps the human requirement to the code. And then once that language becomes common across an organization, no longer are we waiting for somebody else to book time in their calendar to talk about something. Everybody can go collaborate on the same code base and actually review what's in place. So to me, this is, massively important if we're going to both be more secure and we're going to actually be able to get product releases out the door faster.
I think not only that, it's probably a necessity too. Like the whole DevOps movement was about bringing developers and operations people together, and the whole infrastructure as code piece came out of that sort of shift left of application developers, of operations people embedding their requirements inside the development process. So monitoring becomes code, configuration becomes code, because that's how operations people and SREs articulated their things in the world. The classic thing is and sysadmin uses configuration to change their world, and an engineer reaches for code. So as they bring those two together, it becomes necessary. Security people, governance people, compliance people, auditors reach for policy as their tools. And so as we shift left those people into the requirements where we say, let's look at security requirements on day one or compliance requirements on GDPR requirements on day one, we need to be able to let those people articulate the way that those controls in a way they understand, rather than having to make them translated into something else. Policy becomes, some low-level object. If you can tell them you've got a policy, we can translate that policy into code, and we can embed it from day one in the development lifecycle.
A couple things come across to me. So who do you call on to write this code? And do you see a widespread move to shift left? Is that becoming mainstream?
I think if you ask, depending on who you ask, they will have different aspirations as to who should write this code. I think some would say that, the people building the applications themselves are also the ones that code up all the policy and governance that goes alongside those applications. I think some others might say that the right people to codify what those policies are in code are the people that would ultimately be tasked with like enforcing them or dealing with violations and stuff like that. So I think there's probably arguments on both sides of it. I think what I will say is that for most of the companies and customers that I talk to, there remains a pretty big gap that's even more like fundamental than than who is writing it, which is, what is possible for us to actually codify and automate? Because I think even if you look at something like, I think there's constantly like an ebb and flow between, if I take like regulations as an example, like translating those regulations into the actual code themselves, I think is tricky. And the audience for who's going to be automating that is very different. So I think we're kind of early on in terms of the tools that we have available that let us express some of these things. And I think the stuff seems most mature at kind of the classic, probably infrastructure level and up. You have tools like, there's like OPA and Rego. There's like, people that are used to using code to describe things like network rules, access controls, permissions, those kinds of things. But I think there's still a very rich area of governance that is underserved, I think, by tools, which is describing a lot of policy around like behaviorally, how do we deal with certain classes of problems where they're definitely part of regulatory standards and they're things that people care about. But I think, it's early days. Most of what I see so far, though, is not like a ton of dev teams, chomping at the bit to like write policy definitions. I see that far more often, I think, out of the operations side. But, I'm curious if that's similar to what other people observe.
I guess maybe to give a bit of context from some of the place that I normally sit in, my job is always sitting as the consultant between a product integrating into an environment and the environment itself. And to me, there's this huge push for the teams I worked with, and these would have been like governments and things like that, who had a need to standardize across all of the different teams. So they may have a common platform, but multiple sort of ministries working and developing apps out of those. The onus is still on a central team from the security and the policy standpoint. So our push with those teams was particularly to remove as much of the policy writing from an application development team as possible. And the goal was to push that. When we say left, I guess we could be saying we're shifting it left into both the platform and the network and sort of the security team's domains outside of the application team, so that they don't actually have to think about it. It's inherently secure by default. We might give them some knob, but ultimately they're inheriting a set of policy forced from above, which, if consistent and at scale done well, means that whatever environment they're working in, it's the same experience for them, but they don't need to think about writing policy. And most times that I saw, those teams then could only focus on policy around their application, not necessarily around general things like how we're handling SSL certificates or how we're doing pushes to production or things like that. To the other point that you were sort of making, Deepak, though, I think like there's no single tool and there's no single team writing this policy. It kind of depends on the tool steward, I think. So you kind of have people responsible for helping to make and, I guess, accountable for policy ownership, but then you get sort of subject matter experts doing the implementation. And that might be things as simple as, a code review or peer review process inside of your GitHub organization or something like that. That would belong for implementation, be handed off to sort of an owner of that tool. And that could go across a dozen or more tools.
Do you have tool stewards at your place at work, Tiffany?
We do, but I think it's always interesting to note the nature of change, which is something that Deepak also hinted towards. It's just that, with both on the front of governance, first of all, right? Our standards are always changing. Our compliance rules and regulations change, right? It's because our software interacts with the real world, right? And there's real world requirements and policies that get developed there. But on the flip side too, with technologies, our engineering teams are constantly finding like new and better ways of working, right? And then our organizations are there to really try to support these teams and these initiatives so that we can do them. And I think that's one of the things that many organizations are falling behind on. It's just like, what are the new ways of working, and how can our organizational layout help support that?
When you think about the new ways of doing things, what are the things that you're seeing people do? James, for instance, what are you seeing people do?
Well, I think the days of releasing a tool and then coming back and doing like a compliance or a governance audit are gone, right? If you look at GDPR, you are on the hook from day one of that customer's data being in the system. You can't wait 12 months for the first audit to go through the thing. You are up for substantial costs or risks, whatever you want to look at it, from day one. So we need to have so I guess earlier conversations. We need to be having those governance folks need to be able to be comfortable that in order to flip the switch and turn something on, it's going to work from day one. And that's a significant overhead in shipping a product. And if you think people are horrified by having to reach out to a security team and getting a security review, as we sort of as a lot of corporate organizations, the last step in going live is a security audit. If you think that's difficult, GDPR compliance lawyers are a breed apart, and their idea of complexity is significantly higher than security teams. If we're going to do that, we need to embed that in as part of the development lifecycle. We need to be sure that, to some extent, the thing we are flipping the switch on meets or is controllable at least, perhaps, or has controls exposed that can be used to enforce policy from day one.
Boy, there's all kinds of semantics too when you say flip the switch. I was watching actually a highlight reel for the movie Mystery Men. Did any of you ever see that movie back when it came out? And
that's the movie that put Smash Mouth's All Star, on the map before Shrek did it, I guess. So.
Yeah, and there's this one scene where they're trying to get out of the enemy's lair, and he says, "Flip the switch, flip the switch." And they're like, "Do you mean the left switch or the right switch? Which switch do you mean?" "The switch I told you to flip." I mean, there's so many semantics and complicated infrastructure, and that's kind of question I have is with these systems so complex, how do you know what to relay, in terms of what people you want them to do versus what they actually end up doing. And I'm just curious if there's any kind of thinking about that right now.
Well, certainly, I think one place that, at least on the architectural side, I think it tends to come up is, certainly moving things to the cloud, I think in a lot of ways gives people the opportunity to inadvertently, expose themselves to problems that they may not have thought of. I think just because there's so many different ways that you can configure stuff. I think, another big part of it is that as applications kind of get more distributed and there's, you decompose things into smaller pieces, I think that starts to place more importance on the layers that you construct that ensure that everything is connected back together the way that it should be. And I think based on, postmortems of a lot of the security issues that have come up, that are high profile, there's usually some element of a system that was in charge of mediating, the connectivity or who's allowed to talk to what, or what's okay and what's not okay. And are these things supposed to be connected together or are they not? Due to some kinds of issues in that, there's inadvertent, exposure of information or inadvertent allowing of access to certain systems when it wasn't supposed to be that way. And in a lot of these cases, when these systems were initially conceived and initially deployed, that stuff is pretty tidy. But I think as these things take on a life of their own, as they continue to be evolved and iterated upon once they're already post-deployment, you add a new thing, suddenly that, creates way more connections to all the other stuff that you have. Right. And I think it's more exponential than it is linear, which I think kind of puts the onus on, I think, a lot of us in the industry to try to give people better methods of kind of locking that stuff down, codifying the behavior they want to see. But I think the struggle is real, right? I mean, when it's easy to kind of spin up all this stuff, then people are going to do it. And I think if people do it, what are the right mechanisms that we can use to kind of be safe, without compromising kind of the speed and agility that people are looking for?
That it just brings to mind maybe an area, and if anybody wants to, build a new startup, maybe this is where we go. But just thinking in the terms of chaos engineering, right, around policy, how do we, or where do we start to look at test harnesses that validate that that the policy is acting the way it should be acting? And I think that's an important thing, that we might author a set of policy, but it may behave differently than what we expected. And if that is, or it's a bug or whatever the case is, we haven't fully gone to the area that I've seen, or a maturity where the expected result is then validated through some sort of pipeline of our policy. And I think the world goes into infrastructure as code allows us to embed policy as code, but that needs to be put into a pipeline, and then that needs to be continually tested as we start to change how we roll out policy the way an application team would roll out a new change to their application. But right now, I haven't seen much in the way of validating the policy that we put into place.
Code is essentially logic, right? So there's a question if the logic is correct that's being coded.
It's in which, as to take an example, if you look at authorization capabilities or RBAC within Kubernetes, if you're not an expert in how to author those, it is very easy to open a front door. And one asterisk in the wrong spot could mean that a lot more people can do things than you think should. And yet I don't often see right now that sort of validating sort of test. It's like, okay, did we implement a policy? Yeah, we did. Was it a policy that actually did what we wanted it to do? Not too sure. And then that still, to me, from what I've seen, requires kind of human validate on the other side, which is a huge tax.
I like what you're saying, SHEA, about essentially treating our policies and the policies that we build as like any other application, or and building like test suites around them. I think there's been some like nice advancements there that I've seen, even with Open Policy Agent, being able to build like actual test suites around it and doing like validation queries to ensure like, the policies that you're building are actually working the way that they expect them to. But again, like it's a practice, right, and a muscle. But there's some pretty nice guides and tutorials that I've seen and helped written up as well in the space around actually building up test cases that do this.
Yeah, I think you're right. Definitely heading down a strong path there. And they also fail in a nice way. Like if you fail the policy, you get audited but not shut down right away, which is kind of nice. But I guess the challenge I see right now, and you're right, there's tons of tutorials, but not too many people that I know right now understand Rego. So I think there's a product space, and people have recognized the challenge to come up where they are starting to develop solutions to help make that authoring a little bit easier as well. Because typically the people who want to create the code or create the policy aren't going to actually be able to interface with something like Rego to help custom craft them. It's a cool and exciting space, and you're right, there's a ton of work, Tiffany, going on and maturing in that space.
Yeah, 100%. I hope like in the next iteration, we find ways to implement these into our CI/CD processes, right? Like just like we work with continuous integration to run test suites on applications, we should be doing the same thing and integrating these aspects, just like we integrated infrastructure as code into our CI/CD pipelines. Seeing that happen as well would be really nice.
There's two halves to the problem, I think. Before the fact part of it, which I think is what SHEA, you and Tiffany are talking about right now, which is like, what can we validate ahead of time? And then I think there's like post facto, right? Which is, I almost view that in the same way as like you can do performance testing of an application like as part of the development pipeline, right? And then that's not a substitute though for in all cases for having like performance monitoring, that actually checks how it works. So, I think there's definitely still this element that I run into and talking with customers all the time where there's this like, look, I don't know where some of this infrastructure came from, but it's around and my team is responsible for dealing with it. So what is it? Can I validate it? And if it looks fishy, can I quarantine it? Like they have policies for like what to do in these situations, right? But I think it's complementary, where in an ideal world, it's like not just what's before the fact, but it's also post deploy. So you kind of have coverage from day zero, day one, and then day two through the rest of the software's lifetime, which I don't know, 2021, it seems like everything we deploy lasts longer and longer. But which terrifies me, but maybe it's a good thing. Maybe we're just getting better at building stuff and it lasts more.
It's highly optimistic.
I don't know. I think the easiest software to secure is one that you shut down.
Yeah,
it's not running anymore.
That's a policy. If it's over 3 months old, shut it down.
Shut it down. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So how do you handle Kubernetes and container-based infrastructure?
That's a big
It
question.
secures itself.
Yeah.
You know, what's the question? Oh wait, no, it doesn't. It doesn't.
I mean, I think the existence of things like Istio and Envoy have sort of highlighted that base Kubernetes is not an easy thing to create sort of good separation of concerns and good governance and good security controls around. And I don't think either of those solutions quite solve the problem. Certainly not without adding considerable amounts of complexity. So I think it's an unsolved problem. I think there's a bunch of folks in the security space here who are looking at the configuration end, like Sneak and folks like that. But I don't know that there's anyone who's solved it at the sort of pointy end that Deepak's talking about, where it's like in real time, you're able to confirm that the right people have the access to the right resources and the wrong people aren't getting in. I think that's a very much a here be dragons to be determined space.
I've seen a little bit though in that space. I mean, what we're really talking about is runtime enforcement and auditing. I think at that point, which we've gotten to a point. I think OPA can do things like once you turn it on, it will just audit, not necessarily block things, but it can tell you who's violating. So if you're actively working around that, you can determine what policies either need adjustment or what applications need adjustments. But even when you deploy, and I think to the challenge you're pointing out, James, even when you deploy runtime enforcers, and I'm thinking the companies like you've got Aqua or you've got Falco or you've got things like that running in your environment, they kind of force, like they can only start working as soon as if they're running before the application starts up, which almost means you kind of need a policy that says people need to be restarting their containers on a regular basis, which actually in my mind isn't a terrible policy to have anyways, because it ensures that people aren't making changes locally to the container, God forbid, or the fact that, if they're restarting them on a daily basis, well, guess what? We've kind of forced them to build a scalable system because they should know that their systems are going to restart every day. And that would allow the runtime enforcers the possibility to kind of capture things that are already running that might not sort of align with the policy. And then they could block it at that point. But I haven't seen too many people go that far down that line on runtime enforcement yet. I have worked with a couple of companies that do reboot their nodes quite regularly just to kind of spur that type of expectation from their application teams.
Part of the challenge is discovery too. So OPA is great, but like any test suite, it decays, right? And operational reality changes. There needs to be a piece of discoverability in there that says like, here's like the state of the environment. I've discovered it for you, as Deepak indicate. Maybe you don't know who runs that infrastructure. Maybe the infrastructure is maybe run by another department, and then feeds that back to go, okay, well, I'm comparing that against a bunch of policies I have. You should probably quarantine this, or you should probably do something about this, because otherwise the test suite is always the last thing updated, and often it's hacked to get to run, and OPA is no different in that regard.
So what gets missed, for instance, if there's no discoverability or there's limited discoverability?
I mean, your test suite's only as good as what your tests cover, right? So it's same with a unit test or a integration test. You're testing a behavior. If you don't know that a behavior exists, then what are you writing a test for, right? Like if you only allow GET requests from this particular source client like this, but you don't know about source client B, that it perfectly happily talks to the particular pod or a service, and turns out that B has been compromised and you have no idea that it even existed, your test won't catch that. So there needs to be something that sort of is going out in the world and saying, there is a behavior I have seen, you don't have a test for it, but it kind of looks like this other thing over here. Do you want to add that to the test, or are you okay, or do you accept that as an exposure?
I think in the sort of cloud native container based world, I almost think like if I squint, it's like everything sort of gets shunted to like it's a networking thing, right? Like you put the service mesh in place as an intermediary that funnels all network comms, sort of through it, which gives you a control plane to say like, okay, this is allowed from here, this is disallowed from here. And I think it's a double-edged sword. I mean, I think that's a powerful abstraction because you've limited so much of what an individual container can do or an individual pod can do that it almost like has to have access network-wise to other stuff in order to be able to do the job that it's supposed to be doing. But, I think that still leaves open the rest of the surface area, that isn't necessarily like stuff coming from inside one container and talking to another. For example, there's every classic bug that you can imagine, from like someone made a change to say like the pod configuration that gives it maybe inadvertent access to parts of a config map that it wasn't supposed to be accessing, or we turned it on for debugging purposes and left it in, and now it remains there. So if someone happens to deploy a container, it has access to information that maybe you don't want to have access to. Perhaps we've mounted a storage volume where contained on that volume is data that isn't actually supposed to go to any container that's not in this one very specific pod, but maybe for convenience, maybe it's just been time has passed, people forgot about that. You end up inadvertently exposing some of this stuff elsewhere. So I think, there's built-in goodness in like a Kubernetes environment that like it's super opinionated. So they just remove a bunch of the things that you would step on, that would be painful. But it hasn't eliminated it all. And many of them have now just moved up kind of a layer of abstraction where, you're not maybe tweaking the config of an individual container somewhere, but you still kind of have, I think, a lot of the classic config related issues, right? That still can blow up.
Is there any kind of, like an if this then that kind of approach where it's almost like a pipes kind of a process for the policy itself? Or are there any kind of efforts to make it more predictive? So if someone is, so the policy, the policy controls can help, manage it to help the people maybe, who are less inclined to understand the actual programming, but are more inclined to know the policy itself?
I think the answer that I often get about this from, I think, the container, especially the Kubernetes community, is like, well, okay, that's write an operator, to do it.
Okay.
This whole thing is basically a framework for control loops. Like, here you go. And I'm like, okay, that doesn't seem like a super digestible answer, I think, for a large part of the IT populace, right? And certainly not as IT has become like a bigger tent over time. And there's more people that we want to bring in to care about these things and mobilize them to do stuff. But I do think there's, and again, this is maybe distinct from some of the before the fact stuff that I think some of the other panelists were talking about, which I absolutely think is super useful, and we need to continue to lean on and develop tools in that area. But I think post facto is really interesting, because I think in a weird way, the presence of these platforms that you can interact with at a high level of abstraction, just entirely API driven, now gives us an opportunity to express more kind of ops workflows in a way that actually implements some of these things that previously would have been really tough to do because you didn't have the APIs in place. But now, for example, if you wanted to have a workflow that could say, hey, whenever a new pod spins up, or whenever I get a ping from an intrusion detection system that's analyzing my Kubernetes traffic, do the following kind of like multi-step sort of workflow to quarantine parts of the application. Like, that's totally doable now, right? In ways that are much more achievable, I think. I mean, even, like Puppet itself, some of the new products that we've got just do that. Like, they're workflow engines for cloud native operators, and they're using them to solve problems just like that. But I think it's an early market, but I definitely think there's opportunities there, right? There's enough APIs, and the surface area of what you're trying to automate is programmable enough that I think now it gives us an opportunity to build tools, like hopefully accessible tools, not here's a stack of books on how to write Go and then like have fun.
I want to thank everyone for participating. Daryl Taft is my co-host. Thank you so much, Daryl, for participating today and being here.
You got it.
And
it's great. I learned a lot.
Yeah. Deepak, thank you for joining us. CTO at Puppet. Tiffany, very, very good, concise comments. Of course, I like the last one that you stated there about pancakes are only as good as the mix that goes in. I couldn't agree more. SHEA, thanks for bringing your handy spatula axe. It's much appreciated. James, have a great weekend in Brooklyn. And thanks for all your commentary and insights. And may we all go forth and see new kind of developments in this area. I think it's one that we're just beginning to understand a bit better. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm hungry.
Thanks so much.
This has made me very hungry, so I'm going to go eat something.